You know, there's probably nothing that has happened in the last 30 years to rival the birth, the growth, the development of the World Wide Web, of the Internet. And the reason for that is that it empowers everyone. It puts information at everyone's fingertips. I was reading on the aircraft as I came down yesterday an article about Fareed Zakaria, the Time columnist and CNN television talk show host, and a deep thinker. And he was asked what was the most important innovation of the last 200 years, and he said the Internet. And he went on to tell a story about how he was able to lay his hands on the original writings of a letter that would have when he was doing his PhD work would have taken him months to find. But now he was able to go into the library, into the treasury at a university in England and access the original writings in a matter of seconds. It is the most empowering thing that we have invented, I think, in the past 200 years, the Internet. And it has liberated a kind of information revolution. Those of us who work in the communications business, as I do, spend an awful lot of our time these days thinking about the future of the information revolution. How will people consume information and news? It certainly is what we wake up thinking about every day at CNBC. People don't merely sit passively and watch the television anymore. They get their news on their handheld device, on their iPad, on their computer, and they are much more actively engaged in it, as Craig just mentioned. So our panel that will begin right now is on the future of information and of the information revolution. And our moderator is Eric Newton. He's a senior advisor to the president at the nation's leading funder of journalism and media innovation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. He's a decorated journalist as editor of the Oakland Tribune. He was the leader there when that paper won a Pulitzer Prize. His most popular books are Capture the Moment and Crusaders, Scoundrels, and Journalists. Please welcome Eric Newton. Welcome.
Thank you, and good morning. Who has a smartphone today? How many? Okay, think about your phone. How many of you had this exact same phone in 1990? Ridiculous, right? I had 10 phones between that phone and this phone. So what happened between 1990 and today? The digital age happened, an entirely new age of human communication, served up by a real-time, interactive, global computer network we all know as the Internet. It's a time of opportunity and a time of new hope and a time of a lot of new phones. This morning we're going to travel through the past and into the future and look at the information revolution. Think about what it tells us about the future. Media matters, as you heard here just now. It's how you know what's going on. Well, there was an information revolution and information won. The digital age is the fourth great age of human communication. We've gotten through the visual age, language, mass media, and now the digital age. We call it the information explosion because it's happening in a historical heartbeat. Mass media with movable type only 500 years ago, whole history of humanity 500 years ago. The World Wide Web, only 20. So you see the hockey stick graph. It's the ultimate technology adoption curve. From talking to each other, for the first time now, we can talk to the world. Now at the museum, the world's first museum of news, I realized why the pro-information forces had won the revolution. We had on our side two basic human needs, the need to know and the need to tell. Many voices struggling to be heard, many minds struggling to learn. These needs are wired into us. They are growing and changing and boundless, and they are forever going to push the frontiers of media. Now, what that means is that every American generation, not just today, not just social media, every American generation grows up with a new form of media on the rise. The people who grew up with the American Revolution grew up with Tom Paine. Pamphlets were the best sellers. A generation later, during a time of partisan bickering, the weekly papers came into their own. You think things are bad now? Those people are fighting in Congress. So then, generation by generation, we had popular daily newspapers, the Associated Press via the Telegraph, illustrated magazines, then came the big city daily papers, then came the printed photographs, every generation growing up with a new form of media in ascendance. Everybody knows about the fireside chats and the radio generation. After that came the 50s and glossy magazines on the coffee tables, and everyone knows the boomers grew up with television. Now, Gen X grew up with the web and video games. They were the first generation of digital natives. Today's millennials are growing up with social and mobile media. They prefer their media personal, portable, and participatory. So each of America's 12 generations, a different form of media on the rise. I say it will continue, but how? For that, we turn not just to science, but to science fiction. Why? Because it turns out that imagination is a better predictor of the future than extrapolation. In 25 years, we'll be in the era of intelligent media. Sensors, drones, and data, not just here and there, but everywhere. All media will be smart, not just your phone. Garbage cans will know when they're full, robots will know when to empty them, everything will know how to turn itself on and off. You won't drive your car, the car will drive you. After that, biomedia. Computers and the human brain will be able to talk to each other. So people suffering injuries, people suffering old age, will be welcoming of chips, implants, because it will help them. We'll allow media under our skin because it will extend our lives. After that, the age of hypermedia. The lines will blur between people and machines. You really will be able to learn Kung Fu by downloading it into your brain. Machines, the scientists say, could become smarter than us, and some say they'll even have lives of their own. At the end of the 21st century, we'll be in the era of omnimedia. Everything in physical space will exist also, at least as substantially, in cyberspace. Everything will be media. Humans, nature, and machines will be woven into a sentient environment that we can barely imagine today. But by then, we hope we can somehow be in control. Now, I know it sounds crazy, but going to the moon was crazy when Jules Verne wrote it, and geostationary satellites were crazy when Arthur C. Clarke conjured them. Science fiction brought us Star Trek communicators and Skype on the Jetsons cartoons, the tablet in 2001, A Space Odyssey. Crazy, but now common. Fiction, but now fact. And because we're not just seeing a generational change now, We're seeing this entirely new age of digital communication, which is changing much faster and changing much more than what came before. Mass media in the industrial age was like a one-way assembly line. Today, mass media, like everything else, is multi-directional like a web. So let's make it simple. There's only two kinds of organizations in the digital age, those trying to adapt and those that aren't. Which are you? Are you part of the trends of the day? Social media, symbolized by Facebook, going from 0 to 1 billion users in less than a decade. Mobile media, with 5 billion users on Earth and growing. E-commerce, also growing fast. Today's children will have no problem using their phones as wallets. So the media today is portable, personal, and participatory, just like your phone. And we hope this brave new age will bring about a digital renaissance. But today's tools aren't magic. They're extensions of the human mind, both the good thoughts and the others. Now, networks can unite or divide, and cyberspace can be at peace or at war. In his book, Seascape, one of our upcoming panelists has some advice for those of you who are trying to adapt. And here it is. Every company is a media company, and I could say every organization is a media organization. So think about what that means for you. If even one of you changes course after this morning, it'd be worth it for me. And so, fellow time travelers, thank you. You've made it through 400 years in just a few minutes. Congratulate yourselves, and please join me in welcoming our panel to the stage. Okay, I'm here with Larry Kramer and Ellen Levy, and like all successful people in the digital age, they're indescribable, but I will attempt it anyway. Larry is president and publisher of USA Today. He started out in newspapers, and before leading them to found and build and sell MarketWatch. He was the first president of CBS Digital, former chairman of the Online Publishers Association, a member of the many boards, and author of the book we just mentioned, Seascape. Ellen was vice president of corporate development and strategy at LinkedIn. She's often described as the most connected individual in Silicon Valley. Find out what that means. Dr. Levy worked at Apple. She's been with Price Waterhouse, helped Stanford, helped the Clinton Global Initiative. Her PhD is in cognitive psychology, and she specializes in the human computer interaction and information management. Again, welcome. Okay, Larry, we just saw every company is a media company. Could you explain what you're talking about?
Well, sure. It's how, when you look at how communication's changing now, everybody's, the whole process of storytelling is changing. But besides what we in the media have to go through, excuse me, every company has to communicate with its constituencies and now has all these tools to do it. And it used to be they communicated greatly through us, through the media. They'd put out a press release if something was happening. They'd send a letter to employees, things like that if something was going on. But in today's world, they have the ability to touch all of their employees, all of their constituents, all of their customers on a regular basis, and they'd be nuts not to, frankly. So in the process of doing that, they're doing the same thing we're doing in the media. They're learning to communicate with them. And it's changing media, too. It's changing our role, and where do we fit in that process? Because if I'm a CEO and I have a message for my employees, and I have a message for my shareholders, and I have a message for my customers, I'm going to take the most effective route I can to tell that story and to the way I want it to be told, and not have it be filtered if I can avoid it. And what the World Wide Web did and what the internet does to everything is it matches, for lack of a better word, buyers and sellers of everything. Information, a rug, anything you want to buy, you can find someone selling it on the internet, whereas in the old days, you had these systems you'd have to go through, distribution systems. If you're in San Francisco and you wanted to buy a rug, you'd have to go to the rug store in San Francisco, and whatever they were carrying is what you could buy. You want to buy a rug today, you can go to the country you want to go to online, where they manufacture them at whatever price point you want, and you certainly, at the very least, have a lot of leverage in how to deal with that rug manufacturer, that rug store in San Francisco. But the rug company is now communicating directly with you. If you're an auto company, the process of communicating with your customers or potential customers is very, very different today. You have to tell your story. You have to learn how to tell it, and you have to go and learn with the same set of skills we're learning to be where customers are, where they want to read about it, and how they want to read about it.
So all business is changing or should be changing because of this age.
Yeah.
But earlier we looked at how one of the defining characteristics of the age is that any person, not just a company, but any person can use these devices. So I'd like to ask Ellen, does this every company is a media company apply to people? Is every person a media company or a media person?
Yeah, no, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, what's interesting for me, and again, the perspective I have over the last handful of years comes from doing a lot of work at LinkedIn, but more generally, I think it's the same trend we're seeing across the board. You know, when LinkedIn was founded, the notion that every person will have to manage themselves as if they are their own small business takes your principles and moves them down to the point where every individual is that steward of the message about themselves, about the role that they play on behalf of their company, et cetera. And so I do think you're getting to that point. You have the right resources in everyone's hands. It's no longer in the hands of just a few. You have people who now, through their networks and other means, can get to millions of people. And so I look a lot at the situation when we say, you know, a company is a media company. I used to often, when I was working at LinkedIn, go out and talk to companies. And sometimes inside LinkedIn, people say, oh, she works with the companies, not with the individuals. And I kept saying, do you think I'm going and talking to a building? Like, what is a company? A company is a collection of people who happen to have agreed on a shared goal that they're going to try to achieve. And so we are now getting to this fragmented model where we have to think about every individual. I'll give one anecdote that I marvel at everyday phenomenon that show these points over and over if you're looking for it. I assume most people watch the Super Bowl and the whole episode at halftime when the power went out. How many people saw the story about what Oreos did with the ad that they ran, the online? So here's what's fascinating. During the blackout, within minutes, so I will tell you my personal experience, as soon as the blackout happened, I said, go to Twitter, let's see what everyone's saying, right? So first of all, real-time media was my translation. But I think it was less than 5 minutes after the power had gone out, Oreo, the brand, had put out an ad on social media that said, you can still dunk in the dark, right? And it had this great little ad. It looked like it had been designed for weeks by some graphic artist. It was this elegant. And it went around Twitter like crazy. Apparently, within the first handful of hours, they'd gotten 15,000 shares. They had more than doubled the number of people following on Twitter. And I thought to myself, you know, it's amazing the power of how you take an instance and all of a sudden it's everywhere. But here's what also amazed me. Imagine if they'd gotten the message wrong. Somebody sitting there making that graphic and in 5 minutes deciding, do we send it out to the world? What if it had been insensitive somehow or made some reference that somebody found inappropriate? We would be talking about equally in the terms of how negative an action it was. So this power that every individual has is really interesting. Which
gets a little bit back to why media will still exist. I mean, brands and what they mean do stand for something.
You mean media like USA Today?
Yes, one would hope. We're all our own editors these days too. I mean, we have our friends. We look at Facebook, and what that is a compendium of what our friends think we should see. And they're all editors for us. They're personal editors. And we like them because we know they have certain things in common with us. They know us. They do all that. So does media, and media has media is a brand itself, and the brand stands for something. So it could be, in the case of journalism, it could be fairness, it could be certain elements of how a story is going to be presented. You can shortcut and know that if it's coming from this particular place, there are certain standards they live by. And so the traditional media brands actually have value even in today's world, because it's even easier to make something look like something else today.
Yep.
And your mistake, you know, when I was growing up and newspapers were still fairly dominant, you really couldn't just publish a newspaper if you were somebody else and you wanted to you had to buy a press, you had to spend a lot of money, and you had to build a distribution system, and you had to then market yourself and take the year of convincing people that you're a valuable source. Or if you wanted to go on television news, you had to get a license. I mean, there were all these restrictions that made barriers to entry, that made it very hard for somebody if you didn't have a lot of money, to be in that game. And today, you can make a website that looks exactly like the New York Times or USA Today's website for next to nothing. A kid can do it in his room. So the value of understanding what the brand really stands for is important, because it won't happen just visually. You won't look at it and say, well, that must be a respectable newspaper, because look at it. I mean, they've done all these things. So brands, old media for its own value, for its own in its own way, is a much easier place to build a brand than new media, because it's obvious, you see it, and there's some effort that goes into it. Digital media is a much better way and much more efficient way to distribute information and content, but it's also, it trivializes frequently the value that's gone into building an old media brand, or any brand.
You know, I'd tie some themes off what you just said. What's interesting to me about brand is that it has been historically, and is even more important now, I think, it's been a proxy for quality, or some quality assurance, or knowing what the process is. Because if we know what something has gone through to get to us, we actually, we take more comfort that it's accurate, real, you know, you can trust it. The equivalent on the individual side is why you always hear people talking about reputation systems. Any social service, whether it's LinkedIn or Facebook or otherwise, we create what we call reputation systems. And we try to put checks and balances in. And there are entire companies like Clout and otherwise that try to say, who are the nodes that are doing certain things that are starting to establish individual credibility the same way that a brand might already have it. Different in terms of what that means you can get out of them, but I think it's that effort to push the quality we're used to seeing through brands we trust down to the individual.
It's quality and credibility too. I think you know, if you look at the things you do when you're a practicing journalist. So I remember being at the Washington Post, you know, the day before an election. And not surprisingly, a Republican candidate brought in front of us some damning information about a Democratic candidate at around 10 o'clock at night, the night before the election.
Funny how that happens.
And we're looking at things, it could be right, could be wrong, but there was no way to prove it in time to run it and not affect the election.
What'd you do?
We didn't run it. We basically started reporting it, and when we completed reporting, we ran the story with a modicum of truth that was in it. But it wasn't nearly the story that they said it was when they gave it to us, and we couldn't have checked. But what we do as an organization is do that. We try to exert a fairness to the process. And it's different than a blogger. You know, on the other hand, a blogger, what we in newsrooms and journalism had to learn is that bloggers have value too. For the very reason we might not allow a certain blogger to be a journalist, he's too close to a story. He might be in the company he's writing about. He might not be identified. All the different things that go on. That makes him even more interesting to a lot of people who, if they have the ability to see that information, they want to see it.
So Ellen, if Larry's explaining how a journalistic brand, a good journalistic brand, can be formed by following journalistic ethics, by being fair, accurate, contextual, by really searching for truth, trying not to be manipulated. And it may come as a shock to you, but there's something called the Journalism Code of Ethics. There really is one. And many of the best news organizations practice it, individuals practice it, and also the companies have it baked into their company policies. Now, is this the same thing that a person does without sort of thinking about it or knowing it specifically that makes them a node? How do you become not just a regular person tweeting and blogging, but a node?
Well, it's interesting if you look at the trends, whether it's in the workplace and whether an individual is thinking on behalf of him or herself, or whether they're an agent of their company, or whether they're actually assuming the voice of their company, whether it's speaking through the brand. It's the same thing when people are moving content. I think there's two ways I'm most intrigued by people's roles in the information creation and dissemination. One is you actually become a content creator. Right? And that is an interesting question. What standards are you held to? And you probably both know more about how you're trying to manage citizen journalism and everything like that. The second, which I find equally powerful and incredibly needed today, is the curation, right? So a lot of what I've looked at is when people become proxies for what you might be interested in. So if you look at LinkedIn, for those of you on LinkedIn, you've probably seen this, we have a service called LinkedIn Today. It is essentially a little digital newsletter, whether you go to our site or you ask to have it emailed to you, that comes to you each day, and it shows you what articles your network, the people you've connected to, are reading and sharing, and it shows you what people like you are reading. So if you're an executive in Florida who's in a certain industry, maybe we can surface the stories that other people in that industry, in that region, are also reading and consuming and sharing. And the reason I think it's so important is because, as you talked about in your intro, the explosion of not only how much information there is, but how much access we have to it, something's going to have to whittle it down for us.
Right, so this gets to one of the really key issues of the future of journalism and the future of information. One of the things we did as journalistic institutions was we took seriously the role of giving you information we thought you wanted to know and giving you information we thought you needed to know. Whether it was for the government, or who's running the government and what they're doing, or information you might not have asked for.
So interesting stuff, but important
yes,
stuff.
or even interesting stuff you might not have asked for, but would cause you to think, to discover something. Almost in an educational way. We had a small role in that first draft of history kind of thing. But and what digital media does really well, and is getting better at, is what she's talking about, which is bringing you things you know you want, or based on activity you've done that suggests you would want this information, through who your friends are, through what they're interested in, through your own interests, through the habits you have and the things you look at on the web. It knows to bring you not just advertising that might be targeted to you, but information that suggests that if you read this piece, you're probably going to be interested in that piece. That's all very interesting, but the difficulty we're seeing, the hardest thing we're trying to do now in the media world, is to reinvent discovery on these digital platforms, is to give you the chance to turn a page and find something you didn't know. And I laugh because I think back in the history of MarketWatch when I started it, and my first employee who I hired, the company was originally going to do sports information, right? It was a digital company. It was it was 1991, and we were going to do sports information over what the web wasn't around. It was FM sideband. We were broadcasting information over, believe it or not. But I was looking for just an office manager. We put an ad in the Chronicle, and in San Francisco, and so this one young woman graduating from Berkeley was cutting out ads from the paper and put them on her table to go through them and see which ones she might apply to and call. And her mother came running in and opened the door, and it blew all the ads all over the place. So she picked them all up, put them on the table. We were on the back of one of the pages that she had cut out and had the word sports in the ad. And she wouldn't have found it any other way, but she saw it, called us, and she was my longest standing employee, right? She was terrific.
You realize this doesn't happen with Craigslist.
No, so I was thinking about that and about how accidents don't happen in a great digital environment, but how we have to preserve it. So if you look today at USA Today's new digital platforms, our website and our iPad app and our phone app, we're trying to reinvent discovery in the medium. This is not easy. We've made it a horizontal taxonomy, so you actually turn pages. Yeah. You can go up and see kids now. Kids will walk up to a newspaper because they're so used to working on an iPad, and they go, they can't understand why it's not moving. So we've adapted that and said, people are willing to do that. And they're willing to turn a page, and if it's not something they don't want on it, they'll turn the next page. It's something they've understood from the past, and they'll do it, and they don't mind it. And so we've told advertisers we're only going to sell you full page ads on our there's one other unit, but mostly full page ads, and people are going to turn pages, and they can get to that ad one way through search, or they can actually get to it by accident. So you can actually start the process of teaching them they might want to buy a car right there by having this fantastic ad of a car, and something you couldn't do on digital before. Digital advertising, which is doing very well now, is doing very well in the search mode and the ability to bring you something you know you want. If you're going to buy something and you know you want it, there's nothing that beats going to it by search.
Well, I want to ask Ellen, though, is this something that people find very difficult? I know when I'm sending something to my friends, I don't send them something that I send them something, I'm trying to bond, you know, I'm trying to be a friend, and so I send them something I think they'll like. I think I know they know about that topic. I know they're interested in it. So I'm not doing here's the opposite of what you think, or here's something that neither of us knows anything about. I mean, how does that happen in a recommendation world?
Yeah, well, so it's interesting because the recommendation world gets broken down into intentional and then kind of algorithmic inferred recommendations. So for example, when you participate in a site like LinkedIn, your activities actually help our algorithms guess what somebody else like you might want to see. You didn't say, send Joe over there by this article. You can also do that, right? So there's intentionality. To that latter point, I actually have a more general theory around what's happening, and it applies to both information sharing and consumption, but other activities as well, which is it's sharing of intentionality and some of your time that holds meaning for people, right? So the fact that you send me an article suggests you were thinking about what I might care about. And we take these acts all the time, but online it's getting easier to just let it happen. You know, you go and sign up for a service and it says, would you like to email your entire address book? And you click yes, and next thing you know, your address book is getting an email, and they read it going, did she even know she sent this to me? Like it's kind of losing some of that value. So my point on the recommendation engine side is we can either have an inference engine where your behavior suggests to me what I should show other people, or you can actually take very specific actions to show that you are thinking about somebody else and what information they might like. But for the big services, it's much more the inference engine that we create.
Now, the traditional media in the old world made money because people didn't know things. They told people things they didn't know. In this new world where everything is all lit up, how does a company like LinkedIn and a lot of these new media companies make money?
Well, so to answer that, I should at least make sure everyone's got some of the basic understanding. So with a LinkedIn model, it is all about creating a social network. And understanding and maintaining a social network means you understand the nodes, which in our case are the people participating, and how they're connected. And to bring it to light, to get to your answer, what's interesting, let me just use my own network as an example, because I could go get it measured. At the time we did this analysis, I had 1,600 connections on LinkedIn, and that literally meant that I had sent an email to somebody, or they had sent an email to me and said, should we tell the system that we're connected, that professionally we think we're related, and we would interact with each other. So 1,600 people I had done that little handshake with. 1,600 people means that I have about 452,000 second-degree connections. Second degree means I know somebody who knows the person I want, so there's somebody in between us, right, a shared connection. Third degree means we each know somebody and they know each other. If I take my 1,600 people and I look out at the network numbers, that's 15.5 million people that are on my third degree network. So what I think we don't even really think about on a day-to-day basis is how big these networks get. And so, you know, when you look at a site and it says, would you like to share this piece of information with your network, you're not really thinking, yeah, send it to 15 million people, why not, right? And so these things propagate out. Now, what's amazing is it's an amazingly powerful tool. That's why we see stories about people rallying kids. How do you even get to that many kids if you're going to go do We Day? Well, it's because people can tell people who can tell people, and now there's a platform to do it in a thoughtful way. It's how you can crowdsource ideas.
And you have to do it. I mean, if you're a company or something, you have to do it.
So if you have a network like that, you can do all kinds of things. So for example, with LinkedIn, if you want to know the business model on that site, so a lot of the social networks, it's advertising. If you get that many people in front of your service and you can show them information that you can target to them because it's what you know you can make a reasonable guess they're going to be interested in, you can make money in advertising. LinkedIn's model is interesting because we started saying we want to empower professionals and make them more productive and successful. So it's actually got 3 legs to the revenue stool, if you want to speak that way. The first one is matching people looking for talent with people looking for jobs, right? And it's a really nice way of thinking about how do you use a network. But if you're now trying to bring somebody into your company and you can say, I can canvass the world of professionals, and I can actually reach out to them through people I know who know them, and then start to figure out whether there's a fit. The tools we sell to let recruiting and job seeking happen are one of the revenue streams, so everything around talent. The second is marketing, so advertising, marketing solutions, getting to the right professional with the right information. And the third is premium subscriptions. For a handful of the membership, there are additional services we can provide where they'll pay additional dollars for the features they want.
So the information that's provided within LinkedIn is all provided by people.
Yeah.
And so it's totally the kind of in some ways the opposite, where in the journalism world we dig the facts up and stick to the facts, we hope. So, you know, now I want to go back to Larry, because we're in a world where people talk about the gatekeepers are now irrelevant and there's no more gates. Well, funny thing, even though the gates may be gone, millions and millions of people are still walking through where the gates used to be. The path is still there. They've been doing it all their lives. They keep doing it. We expect they'll keep doing it as long as they're around. So that means traditional media, even with a kind of an inverse economic models, you're still making money.
Yeah, and I think there's you know, we have to, the hardest thing to be in traditional media today is to keep track with how people are changing almost hourly how they consume content, how they want to consume it. So for me, it means understand, you know, we have a dozen platforms, different platforms we're on. You know, we have tablets, but we have, you know, iPad, we have BlackBerry's new device, we have Android, we have, yeah, right, all these different patterns. But there, and if you study consumption, the consumption over a 6-month period is changing dramatically. You know, the number of people who said I would look at a video on a cell phone before the iPhone came out was almost zero. Even though Verizon was showing videos on their little flip phones, you could get Vcast or whatever. They still said, no, we're not going to do that. And then then iPhone came out. Within 6 months, half the people on Earth said, yeah, of course I'd look at a video on that. Look at that thing. Even if they didn't own it, they just understood it. So it's a habit that you have to follow. So we have to, both in how we develop news, create that content, have to change. And you know, changing the USA Today newsroom from thinking of itself as a newspaper newsroom into thinking itself as a news source newsroom is a huge job.
What's the big difference between
so
the newspaper
I'll give you an
newsroom?
example. So I went in early when I got there. I sat down with our news editors one day, and there was a story the next day, and it was that we knew was coming. It was the housing number was going to be coming. Everybody was watching what the housing number was.
Housing sales.
Housing starts, right?
Yeah.
And I said, so how are we going to cover that? And they said, well, we'll flash it when the AP runs it, and we'll put it, we'll send an email alert out and our alerts out to everybody, and then we'll start working on the story for the paper. And
The next
day's paper.
yeah.
And I said, really? What happens on all of our websites and all that stuff? Well, we'll put up wires or we'll do all that stuff. So I said, all right, so let me get this straight. We have 2 million subscribers to the paper. We have 50 million people who read us on one digital platform or another. So, and I'll bet you more than half of them never see the newspaper. So to them, USA Today is an AP alert and a bunch of AP stories. So that's a war we lose ultimately to LinkedIn or to Flipboard or to anybody who learns how to present stories in a prettier way. Said, here's how we're going to start doing this tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to have somebody in the lockup, which half of them had never heard of, which is where you learn about the housing number before you're allowed to publish it. You're allowed to put a reporter in. He gets briefed for a half an hour on what it really means before they actually announce the number. So you write a story, you actually are intelligent about what the story says. We're going to have 3 reporters standing outside the lockup. And as soon as he comes out, the first reporter is going to start work right away on the second story, which is going to be 10 minutes later, not the next day, on our site. The second reporter is going to have 4 phones hooked up, already off the hook to the 4 leading sources we always quote in the next day's paper on what does this mean, the housing number went up, but they're all going to be on the line waiting. And we're just going to pick it up and say, 3%, and hear what they have to say about that, and put it right away into the story. The third reporter is going to be actually an artist who's going to have the chart done except for the last number, and who's going to input the last number and pop the chart into all the digital platforms. So now somebody who goes to, now the relationship with USA Today is a real one if you're on our digital platforms, and it's similar at least to the standards and what we do in our print product, because ultimately That's the only way they're going to be getting us. And what the shock waves that sent through a news operation is, is difficult. I mean, it's a change. And it's a change in standards, it's a change in how you do things. You're trying to interpret standards that existed in one medium to multiple other media. Yeah. And you're trying to, but we're at an era where storytelling is changing. This is a Gutenberg moment. USA Today was founded 30 years ago, and it really did change storytelling in newspapers. It really
because of its visual.
Because it used graphics, it used color photos, it used things that nobody was using as part of the storytelling process. It shortened the words, but added these other things. It shortened the number of words, and it effectively told stories. It was a different way, but people going through USA Today could absorb more short facts about things than if they'd read any other paper. They'd have to actually read a story in a paper, the whole story, to learn it. They'd learn pieces of the story from the way we presented it.
Maybe if I can, you mentioned this is almost flipping the balance. What you're describing is, to me, an example of an incredibly fundamental trend that we're in the middle of right now. And what I often talk about is that there's a certain amount of variability in the world, right? And historically, we've gone through a number of decades where the company or the product or whatever it is the fixed thing. It's what we deliver. Mm-hmm. And the variability is absorbed by the people consuming it. Or if you're an employee at a company, the company has a job and either you fit that role or you don't. What we're seeing now is this fundamental shift where the company, the product, the organization has to absorb the variability. Everything is about the person first.
It's a conversation much
And so the
more than
person wants it at a certain time, they want to consume it in a certain way, they want to come to work at certain hours. So I could go across whether it's the employee-employer relationship, whether it's the person reading their content. I mean, look, I can go on a website today and order a pair of tennis shoes exactly the way I want them. They will be the only, like, go to the Nike website,
Tomorrow.
You can get, and they will be N of one, right? I will have my tennis shoe the way I want it. And so we're seeing this shift on everything. Here's what's hard about it, and I think the information world is squarely in the middle of us, is organizational structures and products and services. We haven't had to absorb variability like this before. I could say, oh, I talked to an employee from IBM the other day, and IBM was the thing. Now I have to say, wait, there's hundreds of thousands of employees at IBM, and I have to represent every one of them.
And it gets more complicated because in that whole discussion about what people want to know and what they need to know and what we can give them, we believed that half of our value was in the selection, the curation of what we thought was important. People would come to us to say, what's really important today in the world? I don't have, every day to read every story, and most of those stories weren't available to them before. We were just telling them we curated. Now, they have a million sources. They have a million, from bloggers to any newspaper in the world. They can find anything they want out. So the curation factor is still important. In fact, it's more important how we go in and curate what's out there for you. But complicating that fact is the fact that storytelling itself is changing. It's now, newsrooms of the past were built around mediums, the way she was talking about it. There was a newspaper newsroom, television newsroom, radio newsroom, still are. Newsrooms of the future are built around the subject they cover. So it's about news, or it's about financial news, or it's about San Francisco, or whatever your newsroom covers, and you have to worry about taking that information and transmitting it in every possible way somebody wants to absorb it, and using every possible tool. So the expectation that I, as a news source, I'm going to have video. Video is the most important part of that story. Then video is going to be available to you if you're reading my news organization.
How important is it now for everyone, companies, people, nodes, and organizations of all kinds, to do what we call crowdsource things they do? I mean, you see Super Bowl ads that are, done by the people. How important is that going forward?
You have to pay attention. I mean, it has to be part of what you do. The relationship you have with your customers is much deeper, as she was talking about. It's a two-way street. In news, stories begin when you publish them. They used to end when you published them. Now it's the beginning of the process, because you'll get reaction, you have to deal with it, you have to go back and forth. So in effect, crowdsourcing exists. If 50 people send you emails seconds after you publish a story and say, you've got something wrong, that fact is wrong, and you can check it and it is wrong, crowdsourcing has helped that story, right?
It actually, some of the first crowdsourcing was done in Fort Myers and on a local level. The idea is that the news is better if you ask a lot of people about a story, but it means you're not going to surprise them when they find out you're working on that story because you're talking to them before the story.
So it's interesting. If I try to make sure I think of the broad scope of crowdsourcing. So as a term, there's times where you want to poll a lot of people and you want to find the diamond in the rough, the one person who had this tidbit that you wanted. So that's the one person who got the video of some news event happening, and that person. So you source and you find that needle in a haystack. Then there's the crowdsourcing where you assume that this group together might make up a normal distribution. So if I sample all of you and I get that peak on the distribution, I now have information. And then there's times where you say, look, it's more about what this crowd says than it is about the substance of the thing that they did. So what is the most shared article is usually a very popular one. I never see the most shared article, I shouldn't say never, almost never do I see the most shared article being something very meaty, important, political. It's like my cat ate a frog kind of story, right? I mean, people go, look at that, and then they share it. I mean, you just get these
cheerleaders of the NBA.
Cats on YouTube.
But so my point is that there's different models, and I always look, crowdsourcing is an incredibly powerful tool, but sometimes you don't want to know what the masses think about a very specific thing, and expertise is still really important.
We're winding down, so one last piece of advice to the folks out here today who now, we've all said, are part of this media universe. How can you do well? One last piece of advice for them. Ellen?
How you can do well? Larry, why don't you start with that
one?
one?
That's no fair. How do I know? Buy a newspaper. No. Look, I think you need to build your own news organization. You need to not be afraid to take information and content from multiple places, to share with your friends, do all those things that you should do. But I think you also need to build a relationship with good brands and with reputable organizations, and go out and follow information. You have the ability to find the smartest and best people who talk about the things you're interested in. Do a little work, find them, and use them.
Yeah. And Ellen?
Yeah, mine would be similar, which is I think there's too much information out there, and you have to start to think about what are your effective filters. And one filter can be a brand that you've come to rely on. I actually firmly believe your network can be a very powerful one. You know, it may be that you're still sending newspaper clippings through the mail to somebody you might want to have read it. That's okay too, but there's technologies that let you do it. But I think the ability to be discerning on where did the information come from, what was the original source, and how did it get to you? Those are all things that are no longer all coupled up into one piece of information. It's now pieces you're putting together yourself. And just understanding that that's the process you're using is probably as important as anything.
And I'd say, to end it, two things. One is, however you communicate, tell people what your intentions are, what your purpose is, tell them what your information ethic is. And number two, if you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. Thank you.
There you go. Thank you.
Well done.